now, please give it up for your national treasure, it's Panti!
He's his own man, really, isn't he?
I'm from a small town in County Mayo called Ballinrobe. Ballinrobe is your typical Irish country market town. I just started to feel different than the other boys. I didn't really enjoy the same things that they did. Everybody knows the local gay. I went to London and I sort of got involved in going out and clubbing and drag queens and all that stuff. My job as a drag queen is to commentate from the fringes, to stand on the outside looking in, shouting abuse. Look at me. I'm dressed as a giant woman. I'm the gayest thing in the world. Any soccer hooligan, any fascist, any murderer, any sex offender can get married, but you cannot. Let the gays get married and the sky will fall down. Get behind the campaign, do your bit.
We are on the cusp of significant change that goes way beyond just simply giving marriage rights to gay people.
I think the future for young LGBT people is incredible now in this country. I'm going to be really honest with you before we get started. I'm crapping it. While I breathe life into Panti, she breathed more life into me. How did this happen? It's nuts.
I suppose, in fairness, for most of the audience, you don't need an introduction, but maybe for anyone who's here from abroad, just to say, as Miss Panti, Rory, she is Ireland's foremost gender challenger, and you also describe yourself as an accidental activist. But when you took to the stage of the National Theatre, down the river here and across the other side of the quays, your 10-minute oration, really, it made massive international headlines. But today Rory is with us as Rory, and to talk primarily about your experiences as a gay man in Ireland. And we'll focus, given the audience and the occasion, we'll focus to some extent on health issues. But maybe can we start off with a question on prejudice, and perhaps following some of the clip there. So you're an activist. I think it's fair to say you've been pushed into the limelight to some extent. You've experienced life in small town Ireland. Rory lives not too far from where I live, and it's definitely rural Ireland. And now you've a more cosmopolitan existence here in Dublin. Is there a difference in how prejudice is expressed in both of those environments?
Well, I'm happy to say that I rarely ever face prejudice these days. I think, not specifically. I think in a small town, because they know your mother and your brother, it tends to be a little bit more behind closed doors. Whereas in Dublin, they're more likely to say it to your face. But my experience has generally been very good. And one of the things that I always worried about, that whole thing a few years ago, was that people sort of might get the impression that somehow I was leading this horrible life where people were constantly just shouting abuse and throwing things at me. And of course, that's not the truth at all. But of course, it does sometimes, raise its ugly head. And I was just pointing that out. Yeah.
You're very active in social media.
Yeah.
And I can only imagine, I've not had too many bad experiences on it myself, but it can be a brutal environment, and yet on the other hand, as we heard earlier, and as we all know, a hugely powerful medium. Did you find it supportive experience around then, or were you the victim of a lot of trolling?
No, in general, I find social media, I enjoy it really. Yes, the trolls are all out there, but generally, they don't bother me. It's all water off a duck's back. And generally, anyway, if you click onto a troll's thing, they normally have, 4 followers. Hateful people do not attract, a lot of, friends. All right? Yeah. So normally, I just find it a little sad. And so 90% of the time, I just ignore them. but occasionally I'll sort of amuse myself by interacting with them, and then feel a bit guilty afterwards, you know.
You're a brave man. I don't think...
Well, there's a sort of a very well-known troll that for years was bother anybody who's involved in gay rights or any, you know, sort of liberal agenda stuff. And then this other woman, a documentary maker I know, she had this idea that she wanted to go and find this person, you know, because she didn't use her real name and everything. But, you know, it wouldn't be that hard. So she wanted to track her down and find her, you know. We believed it was a woman. And sort of just turn up on her door and knock on the door. But I was like, oh, don't do that, because I think what will happen is you'll knock on the door and this like little lonely old lady will answer the door, and you know, and she has no friends, and she uses, you know, Twitter to abuse people, but it's her way of interacting with the world, and then you'll suddenly feel terrible about it, and you know, so I dissuaded her from doing it.
Would have made really good TV, though.
Although in the end, that troll was exposed on television anyway,
oh, right.
when she appeared in the audience of something, and then it turns out she was like in her 30s, and she has you know, sociology degree.
Okay, for would-be trollers, now you know the career path. Don't wait till you're an old lady or an old man, obviously. Just on a more personal note, you were diagnosed with HIV in 1995, and you attend St. James's Hospital, not too far from me. You know, just tell us a bit. What was that like? What was that experience like?
Being diagnosed in 1995, well, it was a dramatically different thing than it is now. 1995 was just before any, you know, at the time they were still throwing AZT at everybody, and so my GP diagnosed me, and he's a very nice man, and I felt very sorry for him because, well, he called me and asked me to come in and see him at 5 p.m. Now, I didn't at the time, that meant nothing to me, but now, of course, I know, and probably all the GPs here know, that you call somebody in at 5 p.m. when you don't know how long and horrible it's going to be, and you don't want the other people to be outside. So, so he told me, and he was very uncomfortable because at the time it was a death sentence. That was it. And when he told me, I was, you know, I had known people who died. I was very aware of what he was telling me, and then straight to St. James's, and at the time. The clinic was in the same place where it is now, which is buried away at the back of the hospital. Okay. But at the time, it was the most grim, depressing, awful place you can imagine. Partly because it was a rundown, crappy old building, but mostly because it was just like this sort of, they were managing death is what they were doing in there. And all the patients were the gays, the hemophiliacs, and the junkies, and a few prisoners. And the hemophiliacs were raging that they were there because they hadn't done anything wrong. And on the first visit, they basically, you know, right, here's the deal, and then you leave the doctor's office and you go into the next office next door, which is the social worker, who is telling you, you know, all the benefits you can get, and you can get a blanket allowance, and because it was just all about making the end easier for you in a way. I mean, they thought that, you know, if you're lucky, you might get 3-5 years, or, you know, and if you're very lucky, maybe you'll get 10, but that'd be it. And you're sitting in the clinic with a lot of people from the very edges of society, and lots of them are very sick, and it was a really awful and horrible thing to be doing. But even then, I can't ever speak highly enough of the staff at the clinic there. The doctors, the nurses, everybody, they were always, even then, when it was so horrible, cheerful about it, gallows humor. They never, I never had anything but great faith in them. And in retrospect, I was very lucky because getting diagnosed in 1995 was actually a really good time to get diagnosed because within a year or two, they started to say, oh, well, we have this new drug we're trying on people, and you know, and it's ever since I've been diagnosed, I feel like it's been a constant improvement. So I never really felt like it was all hopeless.
But you had a year of, kind of medieval, almost brutality, the way you're describing it, and then antiretroviral therapy came in.
Yeah, well, when antiretroviral therapies came in first, well, everybody was feeling their way through it. So there was a period where I was on 38 tablets a day. Everybody had that fucking pill box like your granny. You could always tell the AZ queens because they rattled. And some of them had to be taken, with food, some without food, some with fat, some with, whatever. So just taking the tablets was a full-time job. You had to organize your whole life around it, and the side effects were horrible. There was lots of them, but then just every year it got better, and you take less tablets, and now I'm like so many people. I take one tablet every day. I take it in the morning. I sometimes have, did I take that? Because I just do it on automatic pilot. And to be perfectly blunt, it has no effect on my life. I don't feel, like I've got HIV. I just get on with it. I don't think about it at all, except in a context like this when somebody's asking me about it. And even things like, for a few years there, I was taking one particular tablet, and it had side effects. But I thought that was fine. I just left it alone because I was so used to all the worst before. I still thought this was a real blessing. And then after about 3 years, we tried changing the tablet, and now I take a tablet with no side effects for me. It's absolutely nothing. So, yeah, I feel just very lucky about it.
Yeah. It's an incredible journey, isn't it? I mean, in terms of what we deal with and medicine and all the rest of it. That's
well, I sometimes feel uncomfortable,
amazing.
or sometimes I feel like other people want me to be uncomfortable saying that it has no effect on my life. Yeah. Obviously, it does have effects on my life. That's mostly to do around with stigma and prejudice and stuff. Like, I'm single, and I'm sure that's partly because I'm annoying, but it's also partly because you tell somebody when you meet them that you're HIV positive, and there's still so much fear and stuff around it. That's usually the end of that. Yeah. But that is really the only time it affects my life. As an actual patient, it doesn't affect my life at all. I take that tablet and I get on with it. I don't feel any less healthy than anybody else. I expect to be living as long as everybody else. Yeah. I feel it's totally managed. But sometimes when I say that in public, like especially if I say that on radio or something, I will start getting these, emails or tweets or whatever from people giving out to me because they want me to lie about it. They want me to continue the fear about it because they think that if I say, oh, it's fine, you can just take a tablet, that everyone will suddenly run around having unprotected sex and they'll think it's nothing. And so I feel like I'm caught in this odd dilemma because I want to tell the truth, and the truth is it doesn't affect my life anymore. I go to the clinic twice a year. I used to go to the clinic every week, every day sometimes. I go to the clinic twice a year just to check on things, whatever. So that is the truth about it. And those people's fear is that I will give the impression that it's so nothing that it's fine, we can all forget about it. But that's not the truth either. Obviously it is something. You have to deal with, taking your tablet every day, and then you have to deal with the stigma and the prejudice around it. But also, I want people to not be afraid of it because it is the fear of HIV that is leading lots of people to become HIV positive. Twice in the last year, I have had friends who have known me for many, many years who shouldn't have any concerns. They can see how I and other people they know are getting on with it, and that it's absolutely fine. But still, the fear of it is so much that they never went and got tested. And 2 of those ended up in hospital because they didn't know they were HIV positive until they were actually sick with pneumonia. Gosh. And one of them has been in hospital for the last 4 weeks and is only just out. And I wanted to slap him.
Fair enough, yeah.
Because it was the fear of the test that stopped him getting tested. And it is the fear of HIV that stops people going and getting tested.
It's there's a real juxtaposition in what you've just described between all the advances and yet the stigma from the people on the radio or whatever, and that feeding into a very destructive, potentially destructive outcome for your two friends, particularly the chap who ended up hospitalised.
The non-patient medical community are still stuck in 1995.
Right.
That's the fear of it. But I also understand the worries of almost of being seen to minimize it. I don't want to minimize it. It is a massive thing, and it does change your life in a way. You have to start thinking about things very differently. But at the same time, it's that sort of irrational fear of it that actually drives people to behave stupidly, to not get tested, and of course, someone who doesn't know their HIV status is much more of a risk to the community and the people they have sex with than somebody who does know their status.
So it's interesting, you've described how people have reacted to you being able to take your ART in one single dose.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, how are they going to react when the knowledge of the pre-exposure treatment gets out there? Because as you know, even in the medical community, it's just kind of come in the last year or so. But do you think we're going to have, well, you've brought up the societal thing, but as well as that, will there be an issue for perhaps younger men and how they might change their activities or their approach to the illness?
Thing has been a big debate in the gay community for a couple of years already.
Okay.
And it's an acrimonious debate because within the gay community there are, sometimes you think, there's some sort of monolith and they all think the same thing, and they don't. And there are all sorts of gays who disagree with each other about things, and there's a lot of what we call, they call them Truvada whores. Truvada is the
name of the medication.
Yeah. And
Truvada
there's
whores.
a kind
Can you
of thing
explain that? Yeah.
There's an idea that if you give Truvada to everybody, that they'll start, running around sleeping with everybody.
Okay.
You see? So it's a big debate in the gay community. But my attitude is, if you had a vaccine for any other disease, you give it to the people who are at risk. So why is this different? And the reason it's different is because of all this weird stuff we still have around sex and everything. Okay. And part of the reason there's such a stigma around HIV still, and even I feel it a little bit sometimes when I have to tell somebody on HIV, there's this thing, right, you're a dirty whore. There is that thing. Like nobody ever says to a hemophiliac, but there is that thing, as if nobody else has ever had sex or something. Yeah. And the other thing is that there's all that shaming around all STIs, and I think it's part of the reason why physically in St. James's, the Guy Clinic is hidden away at the very back of the hospital, is because there's still so much shame about all STIs. As if somehow, a fucking syphilis is some sort of moral agent. Yeah. And it's not. All of these things, from HIV to all the others, they're just trying to find a way to survive. They're being driven by their genes just like everybody else. And if they could find a way to multiply by infecting, altar boys, they would. Do you know what I mean? They just happen to have found a way by doing it, through, with people who have sex. They're not moral agents. Nature isn't developed that way, and I'm probably doctors would get that more often, or understand that better. Nature is messy and weird and stupid, and and syphilis or HIV, they're not moral agents. They're just trying to survive like everybody else.
My next question, maybe I shouldn't ask because it's going to sound moralistic now, and it's going to perhaps misrepresent all of you here, but given the emphasis that we've had on prevention through safe sex practices, now you've art and PrEP.
Yeah.
Without being, I'm genuinely trying not to be moralistic, but from a care point of view and from a people minding their own health.
Yeah.
Do you think there'll be a certain abandonment of the use of condoms and things like that, or is that?
Well, I hope not, because there's lots of other diseases, syphilis and gonorrhea and all of that. So I hope not. But that's to do with education still. And 15 years ago, you couldn't walk into a gay bar without there being ads everywhere telling you to wear a condom and all that. And all that has sort of really stopped a lot.
Okay.
and I think young people, they think things like HIV don't affect them anymore because they think it's an old guy disease. You know, and that, I have to say too, to harp back on it, is about the stigma. Most people think they don't know anybody with HIV, including most young gay people think they don't know anybody with HIV, because the vast majority of people with HIV are afraid to tell anybody and don't tell anybody. But if every single person, you know, with HIV stood up and said HIV, you'd all discover you know loads of them. There's a lot of us out there, but most people don't feel that they can say that publicly. And if they did feel they could say that publicly, the whole landscape of it would change, because everyone would suddenly realize, actually, this is in my life, and I do know people, you know, and so therefore, it is something I need to be worried about. But I think 20-year-olds don't think like that. 20-year-olds think they're invincible anyway. And certainly when it comes to things like HIV, 20-year-olds have sort of compartmentalized it as something that older people have to worry about.
So are old geezers like me unnecessarily worrying? Because you've been there as the patient where there was no hope. I've been there as the doctor, qualified in 1985, so I think Final Med, we began to hear about HIV and obviously looked after people after that. But so we have a kind of a sense of, you know, not abandoning perhaps something that has worked reasonably well.
Yeah.
So, but is that just totally irrelevant for the younger ones?
No, I don't think it's relevant. I don't think we should abandon condoms for lots of reasons. But you also have to be realistic about it, and the fact is that people do not always use condoms. People sometimes think that, you know, what I always say is, you know, back in the 1950s, when getting pregnant out of marriage was the absolutely worst thing that could happen to a woman, people still got pregnant out of marriage because sex is an incredibly powerful driving force, and, you know, air, food, water, shagging. I mean, that's what we are. And the idea that you can say to, you know, wag a finger at people and say, you should be able to overcome all of these biological, you know, innate urges, these things that are driving you to, you should be able to overcome all of that, you know, and you know, at every moment of your life, especially when you're a horny 22-year-old, it's unrealistic. People will still do stupid things. And sometimes I also feel that sort of shaming about those things that people are, oh, you kind of deserve it or whatever. Well, I say to those people, you can shame me about it if you have never in your whole life ever done a stupid thing. If you have never crossed the road without looking both ways, you know, first. If you have, you know, never taken a corner too fast while driving the car. We all do stupid things. And often we do stupid things when we're not riled up with hormones and there's a gorgeous guy in front of you. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So people do stupid things. So you need to be realistic about that. And just constantly hectoring them about condoms isn't enough. You should tell them to wear condoms, but if they are in an at-risk group, give them fucking PrEP.
Okay. Fair enough. You heard it?
Well, we're lucky enough to live in a country where you can get it. So I'm aware of that.
Yeah.
You know, these things are expensive, and I'm very lucky to be living here and not, you know, living in
developing.
You know,
world, sure. Have you lost friends to AIDS?
Oh, loads. But now I have to say that in the last 10 or 15 years, only one.
Yeah.
And he was an idiot who was diagnosed and was so freaked out about it, he never went back to the clinic.
Right.
And then became very ill. And it devastated everybody in St. James's because he ended up back there when he got very ill and they couldn't.
No, it was too late. Yeah.
It devastated everyone because it had been years since they'd lost a patient like that. So back in the 90s, yes. Yeah, I went to a lot of AIDS funerals. But I'm of the generation where, you know, I felt that impact and whatever. Yeah. But if you're 20 or 22 or, well, even 30 even, you know, they don't.
It doesn't. They've never been there. You mentioned earlier that you're really, you know, very grateful for the doctors and nurses and the whole St. James's setup. I suppose I've never worked in that area, and I'm kind of interested, and I'm sure some of the audience are as well. What's their particular modus operandi? You know, any stories from the front line of HIV medicine?
Well, because it's all changed
in terms of
so much.
Your experiences, yeah.
Like, the clinic experience is odd because it's always the oddest bunch of people. There used to be the hemophiliacs, but, you know,
Dave
Yes,
Sadley,
yes.
yeah.
So it's the gays, it's the addicts and prisoners, and these days a lot of African ladies and their babies. So it's kind of the oddest mix of people. And the addicts, God love them, you know, they're a mess. And they make the clinic difficult, you know, because doctors and nurses spend a lot of time wandering up and down the corridors shouting out the names, you know, of the addict who's disappeared off somewhere or whatever. And it's not an easy clinic to be in, I think. And but even in its darkest days, the staff are incredibly resilient. And I think it must be very difficult to be losing patients regularly. And losing patients regularly while having to deal with the sort of chaos of that clinic or whatever. Over the years, it has improved so much. You were just given a day, and you had to turn up as early as you could, and you could be there for 8 hours. Whereas now, there's a kind of an appointment system. You can be in and out in 2 hours. It's just much different. The clinic's had a bit of a lick of paint and all of that. It's just it's a more efficient and more pleasant experience now than it used to be. There's a lot of sitting around waiting to give bloods, and of course, sometimes with the addicts, it can be hard to get the blood out of them, so that can take a long time.
But so it's been overwhelmingly positive. But let's be honest, we're all seasoned healthcare professionals, and indeed the med students would have been out there as well. I mean, has there been any negative?
I literally have no complaints. I think maybe a particular kind of person is attracted to work in that field or something. I don't know, but there's a.
You must have had one bad experience with a healthcare professional. You sorry. Come on, we're not that good. I'm sorry, we're not that good.
I've certainly never had a bad experience at the guide clinic.
Okay.
If I had one complaint, and I say it to them, but it's not their fault, whatever, is you never know what doctor you're going to see.
Yeah.
And there was a time when I first went in that I used to see the sort of same doctor mostly, and then I felt that she really knew my story, and I knew hers. And whereas now, you know, you'll see a different doctor every time. And I feel I know so much more than they do about my thing, because they've just been given this, you know, file. And, you know, that is the only thing that bothers me. But I understand, you know, that that's not possible necessarily to fix or whatever. But on a personal level, no, they've all been amazing.
I was hoping you'd have something to tell.
That Fiona Mulcahy is a bitch.
Okay, even allegedly won't get you off that one. Jeepers. Stop the recording. Anyway, do you think the clinic in St. James in particular, and I suppose we can say nationwide, do you think they've been given the resources they need?
God, no. Like, especially if you consider like the really worst of times when people were dying all the time, and they were dying, you know, in a clinic which was the crappiest clinic in the whole hospital. And what are there? The only explanation for that is to do with the shame and stigma around it. You know, what are the disease that was killing people, you know, that explicitly all the time, is thrown into a prefab at the back of the hospital?
It sounds almost as bad as like when I was a medical student. In Dr. Stephen's hospital, the STD clinic, well, they're called special clinics, but it was equivalent of a cleaner's cupboard.
Yeah.
So it's a bit worrying to think that, okay, it's a bigger clinic, but it's still the same kind of attitudes are still going on.
It has improved a lot, and it's gotten bigger, and it's whatever, and been cleaned up. But I'm still always just aware that it's sort of tucked away, and you know, you don't see a big, you know, when you walk into the hospital, there's all the arrows pointing you to everywhere else. But yet, you need Jessica Fletcher to help you find the guy clinic.
Yeah, it's interesting because given all the developments that are up there, and as you know, a lot of new buildings and an awful lot of infrastructure, you are still, as in the clinic is still in the same place, and it's still prefabs.
Well, no, it's not prefabs, but you know, it's the little old building at the back. But maybe that's going to change. They are building all around it at the moment.
I don't want to wish this on you or indeed anybody, but let's say you were unfortunate enough in the political sense to be a Minister for Health.
Or to marry him.
I think the question is superfluous. Anyway, what would you do to improve things?
I'd give the Guy Clinic more money. I mean, I think that's all it comes down to.
Yeah.
Really. You know, because I can't fault the people who've looked after me for all of these years, as much as you'd like me to. I honestly can't. I feel very lucky and very well looked after, and sometimes definitely like above and beyond the call. Like I have the cell phone numbers,
Really?
you know, because even you can call me on Saturday if you want,
Yeah.
So
That is
yeah.
really holistic care, and that's what you
Yeah.
can't do that. Okay, we're a small bit behind, so I think I want to thank you very much for coming here today, and I really enjoyed the chat. We could keep going for a good bit longer. You're heading off to Australia next week, so on behalf of everyone here, can I wish you the very best of luck with the trip, and thanks very much for